Now Bedwyn's priests were chanting their prayers in a chamber beside the hall, where holy water had been sprinkled. A cross had been hung over the birthbed, and another put beneath Norwenna's body. "We are praying to the Blessed Virgin Mary," Bedwyn explained, "who, without soiling her sacred body by any carnal knowledge, became Christ's holy mother, and—" "Enough!" Uther growled. The High King was no Christian, and did not like any man attempting to make him one, though he did accept that the Christian god probably had as much power as most other gods. The events of this night were testing that toleration to the limit. Which was why I was there. I was a child on the edge of manhood, a beardless errand-runner who crouched frozen beside the king's chair on the ramparts of Caer Cadern. I had come from Innis Widrin, Merlin's hall, which lay on the northern horizon. My task, if ordered, was to fetch Morgan and her helpers, who waited in a pig-herder's mud hovel at the foot of Caer Cadern's western slope. The Princess Norwenna might want Christ's mother as her midwife, but Uther was ready with the older gods if that newer one failed. And the Christian god did fail. Norwenna's screams became fewer, but her whimpering more desperate, until at last Bishop Bedwyn's wife came from the hall and knelt shivering beside the High King's chair. The baby, Ellen said, would not come, and the mother she feared was dying. Uther waved that last comment aside. The mother was nothing. Only the child mattered, and only then if it was a boy. "High Lord," Ellen began nervously, but Uther was no longer listening. He tapped my head. "Go, boy," he said, and I twisted out of his shadow, leapt down to the fort's interior, and raced across the moon-shadowed whiteness between the buildings. The guards on the western gate watched me run by. Then I was sliding and falling on the ice chute of the western road. I slithered through snow, tore my cloak on a tree stump, and fell heavily into some ice-laden brambles. But I felt nothing, except the huge weight of a kingdom's fate on my young shoulders. "Lady Morgan!" I shouted as I neared the hovel. "Lady Morgan!" She must have been waiting, for the hovel door was immediately flung open, and her gold-masked face shone in the moonlight. "Go!" she screeched at me. "Go!" And I turned and started back up the hill, while around me a pack of Merlin's orphans scrambled through the snow. They were carrying kitchen pots, which they clashed together as they ran, though when the slope grew too steep and treacherous they were forced to hurl the pots on ahead and scramble up behind. Morgan followed more slowly, attended by her slave, Sebil, who carried the necessary charms and herbs. "Set the fires, Derval!" Morgan called up to me. "Fire!" I shouted breathlessly as I scrambled through the gateway. "Fire on the ramparts! Fire!" Bishop Bedwyn protested at Morgan's arrival, but the High King turned on his counsellor in a rage, and the bishop meekly surrendered to the older faith. His priests and monks were ordered out of their makeshift chapel and told to carry firebrands to all parts of the ramparts, and there pile the burning brands with wood and wattle torn out of the huts that clustered inside the fort's northern walls. The fires crackled, then blazed huge in the night, and their smoke hung in the air to make a canopy that would confuse the evil spirits, and so keep them from this place, where a princess and her child were dying. We young ones raced around the ramparts banging pots to make the great noise that would further dizzy the evil ones. "Shout!" I ordered the children from Innis Widrin, and still more children came from the fortress hovels to add their noise to ours. The guards beat their spear shafts against their shields, and the priests piled more wood onto a dozen flaming pyres, while the rest of us screamed our noisy challenges against the evil wraiths that had slithered through the night to curse Norwenna's labour. Morgan, Sebille, Nimue, and one girl child went into the hall. Norwenna screamed, though whether she cried aloud in protest at the coming of Merlin's women, or because the stubborn child was tearing her body in two, we could not tell. More screams sounded, as Morgan expelled the Christian attendants. She threw the 2 crosses into the snow and tossed a handful of mugwort, the woman's herb, onto the fire. Nimue later told me that they put iron nuggets into the damp bed to scare away the evil spirits already lodged there, and laid 7 eagle stones around the writhing woman's head to bring the good spirits down from the gods. Sebille, Morgan's slave, put a birch branch over the hall door, and waved another over the writhing body of the hurting princess. Nimue crouched in the door and urinated on the threshold to keep the evil fairies away from the hall. Then she cupped some of her urine and carried it to Norwenna's bed, where she sprinkled it on the straw as a further precaution against the child's soul being stolen away at the moment of birth. Morgan, her gold mask bright in the flame-light, slapped Norwenna's hands away so she could force a charm of rare amber between the princess's breasts. The small girl, one of Merlin's foundlings, waited in terror at the foot of the bed. Smoke from the newly set fires blurred the stars. Creatures woken in the woods at the foot of Caer Cadern howled at the noise which had erupted above them, while High King Uther raised his eyes to the dying moon and prayed that he had not fetched Morgan too late. Morgan was Uther's natural daughter. The first of the 4 bastards the High King had whelped on Igraine of Gwynedd. Uther would doubtless have preferred Merlin to be there, but Merlin had been gone for months. Gone into nowhere. Gone. It sometimes seemed to us forever, and Morgan, who had learned her skills from Merlin, must take his place on this cold night, in which we clashed pots and shouted until we were hoarse to drive the malevolent fiends away from Caer Cadern. Even Uther joined in the noise-making, though the sound of his staff beating on the rampart's edge was very feeble. Bishop Bedwin was on his knees praying, while his wife, expelled from the birth-room, wept and wailed and called on the Christian God to forgive the heathen witches. But the witchcraft worked, for a child was born alive. The scream Norwenna gave at the moment of birth was worse than any that had preceded it. It was the shriek of an animal in torment, a lament to make the whole night sob. Nimue told me later that Morgan had caused that pain by thrusting her hand into the birth canal and wrenching the baby into this world by brute force. The child came bloody from the tormented mother, and Morgan shouted at the frightened girl to pick the child up, while Nimue tied and bit the cord. It was important that the baby should first be held by a virgin, which is why the girl-child had been taken to the hall. But she was frightened, and would not come close to the blood-wet straw, on which Norwenna now panted, and where the new-born, blood-smeared child lay as though stillborn. "Pick it up!" Morgan yelled. But the girl fled in tears, and so Nimue plucked the baby from the bed and cleared its mouth so that it could snatch its first choking breath. The omens were all so very bad. The haloed moon was waning, and the virgin had fled from the babe that now began to cry aloud. Uther heard the noise, and I saw him close his eyes, as he prayed to the gods that he had been given a boy-child. "Shall I?" Bishop Bedwin asked hesitantly. "Go," Uther snapped. And the bishop scrambled down the wooden ladder, hitched up his robe, and ran across the trampled snow to the hall's door. He stood there for a few seconds, then ran back towards the rampart, waving his hands. "Good news, High Lord, good news!" Bedwin called as he clambered awkwardly up the ladder. "Most excellent news!" "A boy," Uther anticipated the news by breathing the words. "A boy," Bedwin confirmed. "A fine boy." I was crouching near the High King, and I saw tears show at his eyes that were gazing toward the sky. "An heir," Uther said, in a tone of wonder, as though he had not really dared to hope that the gods would favour him. He dabbed at the tears with a fur-gloved hand. "The kingdom is safe, Bedwin," he said. "Praise God, High Lord, it is safe," Bedwin agreed. "A boy," Uther said. Then his huge body was suddenly racked with a terrible cough. It left him panting. "A boy," he said again when his breathing was steady. Morgan came after a while. She climbed the ladder and prostrated her stocky body in front of the High King. Her gold mask gleamed, hiding the horror beneath. Uther touched her shoulder with his staff. "Rise, Morgan," he said. Then he fumbled beneath his robe to find a gold brooch with which to reward her. But Morgan would not take it. "The boy," she said ominously, "is crippled. He has a twisted foot." I saw Bedwin make a sign of the cross, for a crippled prince was the worst omen of this cold night. "How bad?" Uther asked. "Just the foot," Morgan said in a harsh voice. "The leg is properly formed, High Lord, but the prince will never run." From deep inside his swathing fur cloak, Uther chuckled. "Kings don't run, Morgan," he said. "They walk, they rule, they ride, and they reward their good, honest servants. Take the gold." He held the brooch towards her again. It was a piece of thick gold, marvellously wrought into the shape of Uther's talisman, a dragon. But still Morgan would not accept it. "And the boy is the last child Norwenna will ever bear, High Lord," she warned Uther. "We burned the afterbirth, and it did not sound once." The afterbirth was always put on the fire, so that the popping sound it made would tell how many more children the mother would bear. "I listened close," Morgan said, "and it was silent." "The gods wanted it silent," Uther said angrily. "My son is dead," he went on bleakly. "So who else could give Norwenna a boy-child fit to be a king?" Morgan paused. "You, High Lord?" she said at last. Uther chuckled at the thought. Then the chuckle turned into laughter, and finally into another racking cough that bent him forward in lung-aching pain. The coughing passed at last, and he drew in a shuddering breath as he shook his head. "Norwenna's only duty was to drop one boy-child, Morgan, and that she has done. Our duty is to protect him." "With all the strength of Dumnonia," Bedwin added eagerly. "Newborns die easily," Morgan warned the two men in her bleak voice. "Not this one," Uther said fiercely. "Not this one. He will come to you, Morgan, at Innis Wydran, and you will use your skills to make certain he lives. Here, take the brooch." Morgan at last accepted the dragon brooch. The maimed babe was still crying, and the mother was whimpering, but around the ramparts of Caer Cadern, the pot-beaters and fire-tenders were celebrating the news that our kingdom had an heir again. Dumnonia had an Edling, and an Edling's birth meant a great feast and lavish gifts. The bloody birth straw of the bed was brought from the hall and dumped on a fire so that the flames crackled high and bright. A child had been born. All that child now needed was a name, and of that name there could be no doubt. None.